series, we've been talking about the fact that Jesus was tempted 3 times in the wilderness. In the first one, he was tempted in his humanness. He was tempted to live by his senses. Because he was hungry, he was supposed to turn rock into bread. But what we come to find out is we're not called to live by our senses. We're not called to live by just what looks good, feels good, tastes good, sounds good. We're supposed to live in the Spirit. And we're called to live in the Spirit, but there's a temptation when the bottom drops out to just satisfy our wants, needs, and desires, but we're called to be heavenly minded in all that we do. The second temptation, Jesus was purposely taken to the highest point of the temple. And his temptation there was to have a spirit of religion. That what can happen sometimes when we find ourselves in a difficult situation or in the wilderness or in the desert is for us to draw within ourselves to try to come up with our own solutions. And when we do that, we raise ourselves above God and we raise ourselves above others. And when we have a religious spirit, one of our tendencies is to judge God and judge other people, to condemn them. And too many Christians out there are accused of that we are judgmental at times. If you missed any of those, I encourage you to go to radiantonline.org and catch up. You will be blessed. This week, we're going to talk about the third temptation. And if you have your Bible or if you have your electronic device, as we have been the entire series, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 4 today. It is inside your worship guide on the sermon notes. We'll put the verse on the screen as well as we go along. Just follow along in whatever way you're absolutely comfortable today. As we look at Matthew 4, starting in verse 8, it says this. It said, again, the devil took him, that's Jesus, to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you bow down and worship me. Now, there's a lot going on here, as has been true with the other temptations as well, too. So we're going to unpack this a little bit and try to see what's going on in this. One of the first things I want to clear up here, though, is something that I remember hearing when I was a kid, and I've heard a couple of times in life as well, too, and that what the devil is offering Jesus here is he's offering him the earth. Because it's our natural tendency to think of kingdoms in terms of land and boundaries. But that's not what's going on here. We've got to be careful to think that what he's offering him is the earth and it's the land, because that's not consistent with what the Bible has to say. Throughout the Bible, we read, like in Psalm 24:1, that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So he's not offering Jesus here the earth. The idea is that, well, since we sinned, this is no longer God's earth and it's the devil's earth. That's not true and that's not consistent with the Bible. He's not offering him the earth. What he's offering him, as we look into the scripture there, he says, the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. See, he's offering him something else here. The kingdoms of the world. And we know Jesus often talked about kingdom. He wasn't necessarily talking about land governed by boundaries and so forth. Jesus, when he was talking about kingdom, was talking about a realm. It's the same thing here. What Satan is essentially tempting Jesus with is empire. Satan is tempting Jesus with empire. Empires are all about power and control. He is tempting Jesus with the lure that we have as human beings to gravitate and move towards power and control. And our tendency is to build up kingdoms and empires, but it's at the cost of others. That many of us spend our lives building our own kingdoms, building our own realms, living by our own wishes, but we fail to see how our gain can be a loss for somebody else. Now, when we talk about control here, there could be many definitions, but the one I think is best for us today is this. Control is manipulating and massaging your circumstances to get your own desired outcome. You manipulate and massage your circumstances to get your desired outcome. Have you ever been around a controlling person before? That's what they do, don't they? They want to move things and massage the truth and make things say what they think they want to say and move where they want them to move because they have an agenda. They have a plan. Oftentimes when you're around a controller, you simply feel like a pawn in their chess game. We don't like to be controlled, but one of the tendencies in our human fallen nature is to gravitate towards control. In fact, what I will tell you is it's the sin of the garden. I know what to do with this piece of fruit better than God does, right? I am in control of my destiny. I am in control of my future. See, this last one hits right to the heart of our main problem. And the truth is, if we're all being honest with each other, really listen to me here, because you might not like this, but listen anyways. All of us can be control freaks at some point. All of us struggle with control and power in our lives. And in this temptation, Jesus is facing it head on. You see, empires exist to accumulate and maintain their way of life. And they will do so ferociously if need be, and not even realize they're doing it. And so for those who have a controlling spirit or a spirit of empire, there's at least 3 things we need to know about that today. The first one is this: an empire acts selfishly. When we have a controlling spirit, or when we are acting out of the spirit of empire, we're oftentimes most likely selfish. What's in it for me? What's best for me in this situation? And it usually disregards the dignity of other people in its desire to accumulate. It doesn't and rarely pays attention to how my accumulation and getting what I want and what I need, how does that affect the people around me, good or bad? The second thing we need to know about an empire spirit is this: it is a misuse of power. See, what happens in our desire to accumulate is we push our boundaries out and we go places we're not supposed to go. And when we do that and we push our boundaries out, inevitably we run into somebody else's boundary. And then we have problems. It's just like we talked about in the story at the beginning here. What happens if I decide that I don't want to be in my lane anymore? What happens if I decide to go in the next lane, but I'm going to go when I feel like it without any regard to anybody else? What happens is a pileup, is a problem. It's a misuse of power. We talked about it a few weeks ago. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. When we operate out of a spirit of empire, we are misusing power. The third thing we need to know is this: empires are greedy. They are greedy. The largest problem with someone who struggles with control and empire is knowing when enough is enough. There's a lot of people, if we look around, sometimes that's your struggle. I mean, when is enough enough? When is your cup full? When's enough money enough money? When is enough stuff enough stuff? It's difficult to know when you're in a spirit of empire. People who have this spirit, they consume. And in our consumption, we risk failing to see how this hurts someone else. In fact, sometimes a really sick idea creeps in if we're not careful. I got what I deserve, and I guess you did too. If we're not careful, we become callous. We become blind to how our gain is a loss for somebody else. And this doesn't just happen with people. This happens with countries. That's why it's called an empire. We have to be careful that in our gain, it's not a loss for somebody else. And what happens is when you get in this trap of empire building and you get in this trap of having a controlling spirit, you get into this cycle that I call the empire cycle, and I want to talk about that a little bit. You get in this cycle, and it's very difficult to get out of, and you just end up going round and round and round. The first thing that happens that we realize in an empire is empires exist to accumulate. They accumulate. They get bigger. They get larger. And what happens when you get bigger and get larger? You need more. And so you get more, and you need more, and you need more. It becomes an insatiable appetite that you can't seem to feed. And what happens in your pursuit of more and more and more is over time, you begin to feel entitled to what you have. I earned it. I got it. It's mine, therefore I'm entitled to it. Rather than believing and understanding that everything belongs to God and that we are to praise and honor Him for what we have, we believe it is by my sweat of the brow, by my hard work that I earn this. In fact, I am entitled to it. And when that happens, luxuries end up becoming necessities. Luxuries end up becoming necessities. Excess becomes normal, and we lose perspective on how much we have. In fact, that idea creeps in, we deserve it. We deserve this thing. And when it moves from God owns it to I deserve it, we now move into another dangerous part of that cycle, and that's this. Entitlement demands preservation. See, this belongs to me. It's mine. I deserved it. So therefore, it is my job to protect it at all costs. We get into a defensive posture. It's mine, and I must defend this. And we will fight. We will fight to maintain our standard of living. We will fight to maintain our status quo. We will do whatever is necessary to live comfortably in this cycle, in this empire that we have built. But what we find out is when we have to protect it and when we have to fight for it, just as we talked about with the cars earlier and we've been talking about all along, is that preservation has consequences. When we find our life having to preserve and fight and fend off others because this is my empire, this is my stuff, I own it. When we do that, it has consequences. And when we fight others, we end up hurting them, if not worse sometimes. In an empire, you believe that you preserve what you're entitled to, and you are entitled to what you have accumulated. I love this quote from an author. His name's Don Golden. He wrote a book, Jesus Wants to Save Christians Too. Interesting book, title. Quote said this: "The temptation in an ever-expanding empire is to fail to hear the cries of those who haven't directly benefited from the abundance that the empire has been blessed with." Just like the other temptations, the reality here is so subtle, but yet so important for us to understand. In our accumulation, and in our entitlement, and in our need to preserve it at all costs, we sometimes fail to see that what was a gain for us may have been a loss for somebody else. That where we think we are helping, we may be hurting somewhere else. The tempter was offering Jesus power and control, but it's power and control at the loss of someone else. Because empires exist to consume. Empires exist to get bigger. And they will fight to do so. It's tempting to just equate this to large political type kingdom empires. But if we really think about it, many of us have empires of our own, don't we? There's little empires out there. You can be the king of your family. You can be the king in your marriage. You can empire build at your job. There are little empires all over the place that we try to use power and control in a way that we were not created to do. And when we do, we end up bumping into other people and causing all sorts of problems and hurt in our lives. When we try to control them, when we try to do things our own way. And in our control, if something is working well for us and we're benefiting from it, we can lose perspective. We can forget that someone else may not be benefiting from what we're benefiting from. In fact, they may be losing. You see, when we have power, it can be difficult to hear the voice of others. The more we get entangled in this thing called empire, the more we gain, the more we gain, the more we preserve it, the more we preserve it, the more we feel entitled. And what happens at that point is we become enslaved to the need to consume, and we fail to see the effect this has on other people. That is the lure of empire building. That is what happens when we misuse power and we become a controlling person. Because all through the Bible, God warns us, I hear the cries of the oppressed. I hear those who are hurting. I hear those who are in slavery. I hear that cry. We must be careful that we are not the oppressor. God hears that cry. We must be cautious of empire building. We must be cautious of power. We must be cautious of control. And so I have to ask you, what area in your life are you trying to manipulate or massage circumstances to get your desired outcome? Where are you misusing power? Where are you being a controlling person? Where do you struggle with control in your life? See, the temptation in empire building is to believe that the stuff we have is ours. We deserve it. It's our stuff. But at that point, what happens when we fall into that spirit of entitlement and preservation, that this stuff is ours, is that whereas God is supposed to own our stuff ends up owning us. And when our stuff ends up owning us, it has our attention. It has our focus. And so the biggest question we have to ask today is this. When our stuff has us, it has our worship. In your life, what has your worship? What has your worship? Maybe you think, hey, you're kind of stretching this a little far, Jason. Are you sure that's really what's going on here? Well, let's pick the passage back up in Matthew 4, verse 9. What does it say there? It says, all this I will give to you, Satan said, if you bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Worship's a word we use a lot in church. Typically, it kind of gets equated more with the singing time, that time before the teaching where we sing and maybe we clap and we raise hands. But you may be interested to know that has nothing to do with the definition of the word worship. There's several words to describe worship, but there's two primary ones that were used throughout Scripture. The first word meant to bow down, to prostrate yourself in front of God. On your knees, on your hands, head down before God. When's the last time you took that posture before God? When's the last time you were on your knees, on your face, bowing in front of the almighty, holy creator of the universe? The second was a Hebrew word, abad, which literally meant to serve. Written throughout the Bible and written throughout the story is this idea that what you serve has your worship. That which you serve has your worship. And so what we need to know is worship is about who or what you serve. That's why we see it in that verse. Jesus says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Who do you serve? That which has your time, that which has your attention is your master. It is who you serve. And that's why we see Jesus saying in Luke chapter 16, he said, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. But you cannot serve both God and money. Who do you serve? Who has your worship? That's what this third temptation is all about. In your quest for power and control, and in your empire building, when you fail to hear the cries of those who have lost in your gain, and your stuff owns you, My dear friend, if you're being honest and you ask the question, who do you serve? Do you serve yourself, or are you serving God? In your life, who do you serve? Because when we try to accumulate, when we try to misuse power, when we feel entitled, when we control other people, or when our stuff owns us, we are engaging in empire. And when that happens, we are worshiping something other than God. Something else has our attention. In fact, if we're being honest, we're worshiping our stuff other than God. It's a hard place to be. Who has your time? Who has your attention? Who has your focus? We're called to worship God, which gets us to our so what moment. As we wrap up our series, talking through this idea that when the bottom falls out, when things don't happen as planned, when you find yourself in a desert, when you find yourself in a wilderness, you will be confronted and you will face temptation. Jesus faced it, and so will you. And you might be interested, these three temptations that we've talked about, this wasn't the only time that Jesus was going to face them. Jesus was constantly in his humanness facing his human nature throughout his ministry career. There were times Jesus was tired. There was times Jesus was hungry. But throughout that, the challenge constantly was to keep his eyes focused on heavenly things, to live life in the Spirit. And that is your challenge as well, too. You will constantly be facing the need to live by your humanness, by your senses, that what looks good, feels good, sounds good, tastes good, must be good. But the Bible says, no, you're supposed to be living by the Spirit. And Jesus would constantly be confronting the religious leaders of his day, and religion, who he said with its rules and regulations are actually keeping people out of the kingdom rather than letting them in. And he consistently was fighting with them, saying, no, God didn't come to give us rules and regulations. He came to give us life, and life more abundantly. It's not about rules, it's a relationship. And Jesus was constantly at odds with Rome throughout. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is God, God's. What you may be interested to know is where Jesus began his earthly ministry, there in the wilderness, is also where it came to its climax. Maybe you're familiar with the story or not, that right before Jesus was to be arrested and tried, he had a Last Supper with his disciples. And after that supper, they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. And it is there that we see the story of the Bible where Jesus begins to cry out to God, and he's sweating drops of blood. What does he say? In Matthew 26:39, it says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. See, Jesus in his humanness, although he was God, he was human form. He knew the pain he was about to go through. He knew the torture he was about to undergo. He knew the situation he was about to be in. In his humanness, he felt pain. That is why this God can look at you and say, I know what you're feeling. I've been there. Tell me some other God that can say that out there. This God says, I know what you're feeling, and I've been there. But how does he finish up that discussion? And as verse 39 continues, he said, yet not as I will, but as you will. We're not called to live by our senses. We're called to live by God's Spirit in obedience to him. Sometimes you will walk a road of pain. Sometimes there will be trouble. Keep your eyes focused on God, not my will. Your will. And it's interesting that the next people to show up in this story are the temple guards who take him off to the temple to be tried, to be accused of things he didn't do, to be spat on, to be punched. Jesus confronts religion head on. And from there they send him off to Rome to be on trial with Pontius Pilate, ultimately to be crucified on our behalf. Jesus confronts empire head on. See, where Jesus began his ministry, is where it came to a climax. And just as he's going to face those and did face those things in his ministry, you will too. My dear friends, you are going to confront your humanness and this need to just satisfy and be happy, but we're not called to be happy. We're called to live lives of joy. We're not called to live by our senses. You will confront religion and its tendency to put ourselves above God and other people. When we do that, we become a judge and judgmental. We can't do that. The Bible says, judge not. And we will be tempted to be empire builders, to control, manipulate others. And we're not called to live that way either. We are not called to selfishly accumulate at the cost of others. We're called to live for God, and we're called to lay down our lives for others, just as Jesus did. We're called to be humble. So, my dear friends, who has your worship? Who has your attention? Who has your focus? Is it God or something else? May our prayer be the same as Jesus in the garden. Not my will, your will be done. May that be our prayer when you're walking in the wilderness and you face trouble.